Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Just a reminder that the podcast now has Facebook, Instagram and Twitter accounts, so please go and follow me on any or all of those platforms. Today, I investigate an African politician for only the second time. Jacob Zuma served as President of South Africa from 2009 until his resignation in 2018. A divisive figure inside South Africa and out, his life in politics started in his teens, when he was arrested and sent to Robben Island after joining the anti-apartheid African National Congress. After the end of apartheid in the early 90s, he rose through the ranks of the ANC and became the party's leader and the country's president in 2009. His presidency, though, has become a byword for corruption, after it was revealed that he had withdrawn huge sums of money from the public purse to build himself a palatial complex in his home province. His career, as my guest and I discuss today, is a tragedy. It's the story of a genuinely brave and inspiring individual, a great supporter of radical change and revitalisation in apartheid South Africa, atrophying to become the ultimate symbol of stagnation and politics as usual. My guest today is Alec Russell, former news editor of the Financial Times and currently the editor of FT Weekend. Alec spent many years reporting from South Africa and interviewed Zuma on a number of occasions. We discuss Zuma's role in the anti-apartheid struggle, his disastrous presidency, the evolution of the ANC from a protest movement to a party of power, and the complex political legacy of apartheid in modern-day South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Jacob Zuma. Hi Alec, how are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. Very, very glad to be on the podcast.
It's great to have you. We are talking about Jacob Zuma today, Alec. He was the president of South Africa from 2009 until 2018. Why for you is this man's presidency and his political career interesting? What makes it worthy of study and worthy of reporting on, as you're a journalist?
So, Jacob Zuma's life story, he was born in the 1940s in rural South Africa and ends up as South Africa's president in a free post-apartheid South Africa. His life story embodies part of the greatness of the anti-apartheid story, and also part of the disappointment of some of the post-apartheid story. So there's something truly epic about the idea of this son of a rural herdsman rising to become president of this country, a country which for most of his adulthood was undemocratic and which he as a black South African wasn't allowed to vote. Amazing. Unfortunately, his career had a disastrous last chapter or so, and he will go down in history as an appalling president. So it's an astonishing story.
I think that sort of trajectory is one of the things that I want to get across in these podcast episodes as well, is that being controversial, you know, if you're a controversial figure, there is great light and there's great darkness in these characters. It's not, you know, a simple case of somebody being, you know, good or bad. You know, or good or evil. If we talk about Zuma's kind of early life, you mentioned it there in passing. He was born in 1942 in Natal, which is in eastern South Africa, and he joined the African National Congress when he was a teenager. The ANC was already at that point the primary kind of anti-apartheid vehicle in South Africa. Has he spoken about his reasons for becoming so closely involved with the ANC so early in his life when he was so young?
I think that for him it was an obvious move, in as much as that was the direction to go in if you were interested in fighting against the system. But it's a good question you raise, because in his young adulthood, the apartheid system was monolithic, and the anti-apartheid forces, for all their spirit, were infiltrated, crushed, didn't seem to have much hope, actually. And so there were also many people in rural South Africa, and he grew up in a part of rural South Africa, for whom the ANC was pretty meaningless, actually. In those years, it had its strong heartlands of support in the cities, and it had a broadly, for want of another term, middle class leadership. And if you were growing up in an impoverished village a long way from a town, it really was quite a distant entity, the ANC. So it's quite striking that he got involved. He wasn't part of the educated middle class elite at all, and this is a strand that runs through his career and affected his career in the leadership in the countdown to his becoming president, when he was consistently underestimated by his rivals, because they thought, well, this is good old Jacob, who's, hasn't really been educated and isn't part of the great inner circle of the ANC.
I think that kind of the oddly quite elite nature of a lot of these anti-colonial movements is something which transcends post-colonial politics for much of the kind of British Empire countries. Zuma, of course, ended up going to Robben Island as a prisoner in 1959. Do you know anything about the circumstances in which he was sent to prison?
So, well, I certainly know something about the circumstances in which he went to prison, because I remember speaking to one of his direct contemporaries who was sentenced and imprisoned with him and went on the same boat as he did to Robben Island. And he claims that even then, Jacob Zuma was known by his contemporaries as one of the people that made people feel better. He was a people person, and he was singing supposedly on the boat as they went to Robben Island to keep their spirits up, and chanting liberation songs and also old Zulu songs, and saying effectively, "Don't worry, chaps, we'll be back." And that does, well, I'd say two things about that anecdote. One, it was told to me by a friend of his at a time when his supporters were desperately trying to persuade the Western media, including me as the correspondent of the Financial Times, that he might be quite a good president. So you've got to allow for that. But it does also sound authentic, in as much as that's one thing that no one has ever really questioned about the Zuma story, is he's a fun guy. He's a fun guy to be with. It's just being a fun guy doesn't necessarily make you a good president. So in terms of his going to prison, yes, that's one of the things that can be said about him as he headed off there for over a decade. He was part of the early, not the very first lot that went in, but as it were, one of the next big lots that went in. So he went in relatively early. It wasn't the same time as Mandela and the Rivonia trialists, but it was the next lot in, really.
And he obviously went in when he was very young. He was much young. I think he's about 25 years younger than Nelson Mandela. But I imagine that having been locked up in Robben Island, he was regarded as a figure of courage against the apartheid regime after he was released. This was at the start of the 70s. How did Zuma kind of help the ANC in the 70s after he was released from prison, in the context of some very authoritarian measures deployed by the apartheid state? I'm thinking particularly about things like the Soweto uprising in 1976.
So he left prison in the mid 70s, and you have to understand the context of the time. The mid 70s, before the Soweto uprising in 1976, seemed very tranquil politically in South Africa. The apartheid government felt that it pretty much got the liberation forces licked. There were some in exile in London. some in what were called the frontline states, but there was minimal political activity in South Africa. And in exile, the ANC was still trying to mobilize itself. And Zuma was part of this cohort that came out of Robben Island. And of course, one, that gives you a great sort of illustrious story if you're one of the Robben Islanders, and he's had that right, obviously, subsequently right through his career. He went off. I think he went off, started in Swaziland, and became very rapidly a very adept exile politician, and he rose quite rapidly through the exiled ranks, and it's a tribute to his sort of savvy political skills, because it's not an easy environment operating in exile. Not easy because you know that that the apartheid state is, one, trying to monitor you, and two, might be trying to kill you. And two, the internal politics of the ANC were quite messy. There were rifts, there were splits. It's what happens in political movements that are under pressure. You get internal fissures, and he managed to navigate them very adroitly, and became a very senior figure in the ANC's intelligence wing, and gained a reputation for himself, shall we say, in the late 70s, but then increasingly in the 80s as an important figure in a way that might not have been expected when he went to Robben Island, for example.
And what sort of things were the intelligence wing of the ANC doing to try and disrupt the apartheid regime at that time?
Well, the intelligence wing was obviously trying to understand the workings of the apartheid state. It was trying to work out where its vulnerabilities were. It was trying to work out how you infiltrate people into the system, infiltrate people into South Africa. So Zuma was involved in the in overseeing the process of shipping mainly young men back into South Africa to stir up trouble. And that's a difficult role, because quite often he was sending people off to their deaths. They'd get caught, they'd get tortured, they'd certainly get imprisoned, they might get shot. A lot of people were picked up, and quite a few were shot. So that was obviously an element of what he was doing. He was also trying to understand the politics of some of these frontline states, which themselves were troubled, complex, and had all sorts of different political strands running through them, with the influence, say, of Moscow, Beijing, the involvement and interest of British intelligence, the CIA. All of them were playing in this sphere in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, where at different times the ANC was particularly involved and based, ultimately more in Lusaka. So there was that element. Then there's also the internal ANC side of things. There were from time to time in the camps, in the ANC's camps where they were training up young men, there were revolts. There was the odd mutiny, and so it was understanding and being on top of the internal politics as well, and that was quite messy. So there were those three different spheres that he was involved in. But then towards the mid 80s and beyond, then came the really interesting stuff in terms of history. The secret talks. The talks about talks, which were known about by only a few in the ANC and only a few in the apartheid state, which were the first contacts, which were, of course, would have been totally denied if anything had come out of this, totally denied by the white South African government. But these were talks that were held primarily in rural England, in Somerset, I think. I think it may even be in Mells, Somerset. And these were the first contacts between the ANC and representatives of the Afrikaner nationalist government to try and work out, how do we avoid a total cataclysm? How can we negotiate a deal?
I'm interested in what you've said about the internal politics of the ANC, because obviously it's worth pointing out to people that don't know, South Africa is an immensely heterogeneous country in terms of, its linguistic and ethnic composition. One of the most, multi-ethnic countries in the world. And I suppose that kind of manifests itself in the politics of the ANC and the politics of the country more widely. What do you think, before we talk about the 1980s, what do you think Zuma's personal politics at this stage was like? Do you think he, beyond the kind of anti-apartheid politics that defined his whole party, do you think he had a particularly sophisticated ideological view of where he wanted South Africa to go post-apartheid?
I don't think he did have a very clear idea of how he wanted to, or how he envisaged the running of the government at the end of apartheid. I think that he, perfectly reasonably actually, he wasn't thinking about that stuff, I would guess, that much. He was thinking about, how do I bring this system down? And that just seemed like an unbelievably difficult mission. I mean, they weren't, the ANC and its armed wing, they weren't going to bring down apartheid on the battlefield. They realized that it was going to require something else. The townships could be ablaze, and they could have gone on being they were ablaze from the mid-80s onwards. And it played out on Western, in particular, television screens night after night after night. But actually, South Africa could have endured that for a lot longer without the country falling, and without the ANC taking over. So it was a big challenge that they faced. And I don't think it was his thing to think about how the country could be governed, what sort of a system you were looking for. He was part of the traditional ANC socialist mindset, I guess, if he said anything, whereby, he'd listen to what the Russian advisors said and thought it's very simple. Capitalism is the system of the oppressor. Can't have much truck with that. And it was others in the ANC that were grappling with the questions of running an economy and how do you really run an efficient state. That wasn't his gig.
The ANC had obviously been banned the whole way through Zuma's life, but in 1990, after these talks that you've just discussed had started, the ANC was legalised in 1990 at the same time as Nelson Mandela was released from Robben Island prison. Can you explain a bit about the period from 1990 until 94, which was when Mandela became president? What do you think, in terms of Zuma's story, is important to know about that period, just for people who don't necessarily know very much about that period of South African history?
So the period from 1990 to 94, as in the period between the release of Nelson Mandela in February 1990 and his election in April 94 and his inauguration in May 94, is funnily enough, it's one of these periods which is potentially almost forgotten about already in the histories, in the broad sweeping histories of South Africa, because you think decades of apartheid, release of Mandela becomes president, oh my God, isn't this amazing? Actually, they were 4 appalling years. There was massive bloodshed broadly between the ANC supporters and supporters of a Zulu nationalist party, the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was predominantly based in KwaZulu-Natal, Jacob Zuma's homeland, but also based in the townships around the big cities, in particular Johannesburg. Thousands of people were killed in these years. There was also bloodshed. There was blood spilt by the white government's security forces. It was a very, very turbulent and troubled time, and a time in which many of the hopes that accompanied Nelson Mandela's release seemed to be evaporating before people's eyes. And people again thought, oh my gosh, is this country going to be able to hold itself together? Now, here's where Jacob Zuma comes in. In many ways, this was actually, looking back on it, these were his glory days, which sounds an odd thing to say, we're having just talked about turbulence and bloodshed. But bear in mind, as I said, that the worst of the bloodshed was in KwaZulu-Natal. And Jacob Zuma was one of the people who was deployed by the ANC to try and bring peace to this troubled region. And he didn't do it on his own. There were all sorts of factors that came into play, but he did work darn hard at it and played an important role in first trying to bring peace and ultimately bringing peace. And I remember that was the first time I'd encountered him must have been around 1993, and this sort of harassed, tired figure in some small town in KwaZulu-Natal who was far too busy to talk to a young Western reporter who just sort of wanted to ask some inane question about, well, how's the peace attempt going? But that was what he was deployed by the ANC to do, and it contributed to the Jacob Zuma story. He became known as somebody who was good at bringing people together and good at compromises and patient and a listener and so on. So this was an important period for his political career. And the only other thing I'd say about that time, it was only at the very last minute, just before the election in April 94, that it was clear that it was all going to go ahead. There were still white right-wingers who were letting off bombs and killing people in Johannesburg and elsewhere, right down to the wire, the very last days before the election. And just a few weeks before the election, I remember being in Johannesburg, and there was a big rally of Zulu nationalist demonstrators in the center of Johannesburg, and this huge gun battle erupted in front of me in the library gardens, and there were something like a dozen people shot dead in the center of Johannesburg. So it was an appalling time, and Jacob Zuma's part in it was a good one.
I think you're talking about somebody who's clearly got immense skill politically and to bring people together. As I said a minute ago, South Africa is a very culturally and ethnically diverse country. I think I'm right in saying that Zuma is a Zulu ethnically.
He is.
Has his Zulu identity been important in his rise in politics?
Yes, it has. It's been very important and very controversial. So one of the key philosophies of the ANC was that it was non-tribal. Tribalism and the badge of tribes was something that was deemed part of the apartheid system. That's what the white minority rulers had been trying to do. They've been saying, you're a Zulu, you're this, you're that. And then, of course, the whole sort of racial designation, the ANC was going to rise above that. There was a legendary a sort of liberation philosopher leader who talked about, for the nation to rise, the tribe must die. And the ANC firmly believed that was a part that basically talking about one's tribe was part of the past. And so the ANC sought publicly, but also privately, to rise above it. There was one slightly inconvenient element that some in the ANC would privately point out, which is that for long years the party was really run by a tribe in eastern South Africa called the Xhosas, the Xhosa tribe. There was a famous Zulu leader, Albert Luthuli, in the 60s, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. But otherwise, broadly speaking, since then, it had been dominated by Xhosas. And that was a source of just a little bit of irritation amongst some other black South Africans. One shouldn't overstress it. I think it became something that it was too easy to sort of make out that it was some massive rift. But Jacob Zuma, as he started to jostle for primacy in the years after Nelson Mandela had stepped down, Nelson Mandela governed for 5 years, and then said very publicly, I'm not going to stand for another term. I'm an old man. It's time to pass on to the next generation. So he passed on the baton to the deputy president, Thabo Mbeki, who was also from the Eastern Cape, also from the Xhosa tribe. And Jacob Zuma was then a senior figure, became deputy president, fell out with Thabo Mbeki, and as he sought a way of returning to the front line and even competing with Thabo Mbeki and even ultimately trying to unseat him, he played the Zulu card. And that was a very, very striking moment in South African politics, because you suddenly saw supporters at rallies for him wearing T-shirts saying 100% Zulu boy. This was something that was just, for old school ANC supporters and leaders, was an abomination. This was appalling. And they felt that Jacob Zuma had broken a taboo and had thrown the whole history and culture of the party to one side in pursuit of raw power, in raw pursuit of power. And he had, really. He just realized that this was the way to go, that he needed to, as they say, fire up his base. And he fired up his base. And so first off, he motivated the millions of Zulus, mainly in KwaZulu-Natal, to get fired up on his behalf. So he became something of a sort of Zulu populist figure.
I mean, I suppose there's an advantage in going after one tribal group, one particular niche within society, like the Zulus. But obviously, to play devil's advocate to what you've said, a problem that might have presented for Zuma was that other people were not going to vote for him, and perhaps if he had taken a more kind of conciliatory approach, he could have transcended tribal lines. Do you understand what I mean? In a system where you're trying to get as many votes as possible, pigeonholing yourself to one tribal group may not be a particularly clever strategy.
No, you're right. You've got to. You need more than even the voluminous Zulu constituency to win, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think it was a way of showing the heart of his support, in a sense. So he motivated these crowds, and he activated in public his supercharged charisma, for want of another term, and just played it for all it was worth, and did this at a time when the then president, Nelson Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki, was patently struggling to connect with the electorate. Mbeki, cerebral figure, really important in shaping the ANC's political philosophy, and in coming up with a viable economic policy that was going to have a crack at working for South Africa. But he was he came across as more of a technocrat, aloof, not interested in the silky side of politics. I'm trying to think of a British analogy. I don't know. It's
well, possibly the two leaders that we have right now.
Yes, or Gordon Brown, very good at talking about macroeconomic policy, less good at revving people up on a podium when people want to be fired up to vote. And yes, as you say, not a bad analogy in terms of what we have now with the populist prime minister, very good at saying things that get people excited and so on, and a more dry and cerebral opposition leader. In this case, the cerebral figure was the president, who was out of touch with the ANC rank and file, and as the years passed and the economy was doing okay, but there were lots of people that weren't feeling the benefits of the growth that was supposed to be powering South Africa onwards. The situation was ripe for a more populist figure to come in, and that was Jacob Zuma.
So that wasn't until 2009. Zuma became president in 2009. He was obviously the candidate of the ANC, the African National Congress. I'm taking from what you've said so far that his candidacy in 2009 was not inevitable. What was the reason, do you think, in the end that he was chosen? Was it this? Did he actually have to run against Mbeki in the end, or had Mbeki sort of reached the end of his term and it sort of fell to Zuma?
Jacob Zuma was, in the first decade of this century, was fighting for not just his political life, but was fighting for his freedom. He got mired in a colossal corruption scandal, which stemmed, in principle, from the activities of his financial advisor, part-time financial advisor. And this all dated back to a colossal arms deal, which was one of the big post-apartheid deals, and there was clearly a lot of money sloshing around and a lot of backhanders. And Zuma's advisor, Shabir Sheikh, got caught up in all this. And then it was clear that Zuma himself was implicated in some of this stuff. And this was all hanging over him. Then there was a separate trial that he got caught up in when he was accused of rape. And so by 2005, 2006, I think there were many people in the Mbeki camp that thought Zuma's done. He's finished. He's no threat. So to be clear, there was nothing inevitable about him succeeding Thabo Mbeki. He was Thabo Mbeki's deputy president for a while. Then he had to step down. He was fired because of all this stuff. And he had, I guess, two options. He could either just disappear and try and fight these cases. He was acquitted in the rape trials, slightly controversially in some quarters. But instead he decided to fight. And I remember going to his birthday party must have been in 2007 in Durban. And I thought it was the most extraordinary thing in this huge hotel ballroom in Durban. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people, including many of the town's business elite and so on, all paying court to him. And I thought, you know what? This guy is not down and out. He's got money pouring into his campaign coffers, and he's got this adoring crowd of people. And these were not just, as I say, not just sort of foot soldiers of a campaign. These were serious political activists and so on. And then he just fought a good campaign. And he fought a good campaign at a time when Thabo Mbeki and his lot, well, they were busy running the country, which is one thing, and one shouldn't forget that. But also, I think they didn't think they needed to do anything. I think they just thought it was all sorted out. And they went to the party conference. It's a 5-yearly affair, and it was in late 2007 in a town in the north of South Africa called Polokwane. And Thabo Mbeki's crowd thought that they had it in the bag, and they didn't. And he was outvoted, and the new leader of the ANC was Jacob Zuma. Thabo Mbeki stayed on as president for a bit longer, but ended up not even seeing out his term. It was an astonishing thing. There'd been an internal party insurrection, and the one thing I would say on behalf of the ANC, which is often now accused of being sclerotic and anti-democratic and a sort of monolithical kind of constrictor of the state. Well, you know what? It had internal democracy. The party decided it had had enough of its leader, and it got rid of him.
That's quite an interesting feature of South African politics. Like, the ANC has obviously not been out of power since 1994. It's won every post-apartheid election. How would you describe its politics? Is it very ideological, or is it basically just a party of incumbency, a party of power? And how has it adapted to being a party of government rather than the party of opposition and the party of protest that essentially it was pre-94?
Well, these questions go to the heart of it, really. It has been very clear for decades that it's quite hard to go from being a liberation movement to being a party of government. It's not easy to be a revolutionary force that's trying to overthrow either a colonial system or, in this case, long entrenched white minority government. And then suddenly you're running the country, and it's not just about the whole business of governing, which of course is difficult, but it's also actually quite hard to go from being a liberation movement to being a functioning political party as well. You're used to operating in some secrecy in a clandestine way and having particular ways of doing things. And so, first off, I think you'd have to say that actually in the early years, the ANC adjusted really quite well. You know what? They had an extraordinarily deep bench of really talented figures who took over the ministries. And yes, there were some duds in Mandela's Mandela's cabinet, which was 5 years from 94 to 99. Of course, there were some people who he and the party owed stuff to, but overall the caliber was incredibly high. But in the subsequent years, partly because they've just now been in power a long time, and after 10 years or so, as we know here and we see in all sorts of places, you do run out of puff as a political party if you're in power too long. There's nothing like a period of opposition to refocus and so on. But I think they have become a classic incumbent party that is in power because it's in power. And yes, again, you have to say there remain all sorts of people in the ANC who are still committed to the founding principles of a non-racist, non-sexist society, trying to make it a fairer society. But there are also an awful lot of people who now are in the ANC who just see it as a ticket to wealth and patronage, and that was one of the syndromes that really developed under Jacob Zuma.
Well, let's talk about Zuma's presidency directly then, Alec. I mean, he became president in 2009, and his presidency, as you said at the start of the interview, is not remembered fondly. It's no point in beating about a bush, really. I mean, I think, at least in the West, he's become a very simple personification of corruption, really. Can you go into some of the accusations of corruption that are levied against Zuma, and do you think that at the core of them is this conflation of the ANC and the state?
Well, I'll start by saying something which is very rare to hear now, but just a little note of sympathy for Jacob Zuma, just briefly. It
sure.
won't be my last word, but just briefly. Just picture the scene in the early 1990s when the ANC has been unbanned after decades in which its operatives have either been in prison or underground or in exile. And most of them, in Jacob Zuma's case, first underground, then in prison, then in exile. He got a stipend from the ANC to pay his expenses to keep him on the road. But when he turns up in South Africa, he has nothing. Doesn't have a penny to his name. This great liberating hero, he returns, glorious figure, doesn't have a rand in his bank account. And I think that if one were to start again, maybe some all-seeing figure would have thought, you know what, we need to rapidly set in place a decent fund for some of these figures who are going to be leading figures in the new order, because otherwise they were going to fall prey to predatory business figures who were going to just turn up and offer them money for this. We'll sort out, you need a house, we'll get you a house, you need a car, we'll get you a car, you need this, blah, 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 blah. And then a year or so later, it transpires that in return for that, these people get, or some of them get, a nice juicy contract to do this, and it didn't go through the normal government tenders and whatever, and then there's a bit more money. Now, this is not remotely to excuse the appalling corrupt system that Jacob Zuma presided over, but I do think that there's there is a nuance to how this all started that is just worth bearing in mind. And I think I look back sometimes at what I wrote when he was taking office, just when he was, and maybe I was a little bit too generous, but there was this sense of a new broom that actually maybe South Africa needed a more genial figure. Maybe South Africans needed someone to kind of buoy them up again after these austere years under Thabo Mbeki's leadership, or these years of an austere leader, should I say. So there was this idea around that, yes, he'd been caught up in this corruption stuff, but maybe as president, he would just bring a new tone to government and bring more people on board in the nation so they could sort of get going again. Of course, none of that really happened. Yes, he did briefly preside over some enthusiastic rallies, but also what he presided over was a looting of several of the offices of the state and a gutting of some of the sort of traditional enforcers of what is right. So it is a disaster story, his presidency, I'm afraid.
I suppose an important question, though, is how corrupt was he compared to other people within the system? Is this issue of corruption a problem that's larger than Zuma himself? That's got to be an important part of the analysis of how bad his presidency was.
Yeah, well, gosh. So I guess that's where you get onto the issue of who is the guiltier party. Is it the leader who ends up presiding over the corrupt system, or is it the enablers who come to this leader and lead him or her down the wrong path, however willingly it may be? So yes, there were a number of people in this case. In particular, there was this family, the Gupta family, who were very close to him, who were the driving forces behind some of the most egregious corruption and abuses. So it's not just Jacob Zuma. I mean, I think with Zuma himself, again, a somewhat charitable view would be that he was led down this path rather than leading the country down this path and just signed off on all sorts of stuff. So he's guilty of carelessness, evasiveness, recklessness, but he wasn't the one who was coming up with all the master plans for how we do this, how we eviscerate the public protector or whatever. But I think that's a bit charitable. He just ended up treating government as his personal fief, really, and anything went. And this is where the less sort of appealing traits of his long years as an exile operative working in the shadows come into play. And I think he worked in a very, very, should we say, untransparent way, and saw plots and conspiracies, and just tried to use the state and the security services any way he could for enrichment, and thought that it was his right. So he built up this huge, whatever you call it, sort of palatial home in Kandla, and you get a good salary as president, and good expenses and good allowances, but this was all sort of way off the charts. And I don't think there's any exoneration at all. I remember I interviewed him about 2 years into his presidency, having not seen him for 2 years, having interviewed him many times in the countdown to his becoming leader of the ANC, and between his being leader of the ANC and president of South Africa. And then about 2 years had passed, and I went to see him, and I mean, it's easy to get a bit over psychoanalytical, but he did already seem a diminished figure, and defensive, and unwilling to acknowledge anything, in a way that when he was in the ascendancy and trying to become the ANC leader, he was much more open and prepared to admit his weaknesses. And the thing I think of when I see him now and look at the disastrous impact that his presidency had, disastrous impact it had not just on the running of South Africa or its finances, but on South Africa's reputation, I think it's just such a shame that his story, his life story, should have and could have ended so differently. This heroic figure who'd done all this stuff in exile, some quite dangerous stuff. He was probably, actually, there were all sorts of things he was implicated in out there that we may never know. I'm not saying it was all utterly illustrious, but it was brave, and it was fighting against apartheid. And he comes back, and then he's working away to try and bring peace in KwaZulu-Natal. And then he spends time, when Nelson Mandela is president, as the party leader in KwaZulu-Natal. And then he should have just been allowed to retire, been given a huge state pension for, a life dedicated to the overthrow of a racist, oppressive system, and just spent his last 15, 20 years just as a hero of the revolution. And instead, he stays in politics, and he'll go down in history as this appalling president who led South Africa down a dead end from which it's quite hard to extricate itself.
There's two more questions I want to ask you, Alex. I don't know how much time you have left with me, but
whatever it takes, Tom.
Okay. I think something else, another area where Zuma's time in office is not remembered well, is the kind of economic performance of South Africa more generally. I think it's fair to say that South Africans were feeling quite positive about their economy in the late 2000s, or at least some of them were. South Africa was in the BRICS countries, these fast developing countries alongside Brazil and Russia and India and China. Why has South Africa's economic prospects over the last decade not really improved in the way that people thought it might? And can you attribute that underperformance to Zuma? Or maybe you think that actually the economy there hasn't underperformed and that the expectations were just overblown?
You know what? There are many things you can attribute to Zuma, but it's probably unfair to attribute South Africa's economic underperformance wholly to Jacob Zuma. South Africa rode very high in the late 90s, early 2000s, off the back of two things. One, yes, the prudent, savvy management of Thabo Mbeki and his finance minister, Trevor Manuel. The other thing, though, the commodity boom. Commodity boom was terrific for South Africa. And I think that many in South Africa hadn't realized how much their fortunes were tethered to the commodity cycle. And then when the commodity boom ended sort of broadly around the time Jacob Zuma took over, the super cycle certainly, it became rather harder for South Africa. So I think that, yes, international confidence in South Africa, Inc., as it were, dropped massively when Zuma was in charge. Totally different to when Thabo Mbeki was in charge. Thabo Mbeki would go to Davos, for example, or would just talk to people, and he talked their language. He was a serious figure who understood macroeconomics. Jacob Zuma, that was not what he was going to do. So his reign was bad for South Africa's standing, and yes, the ANC under him underperformed in its management of all sorts of things, including its management of the economy. But I do think that it's the commodity cycle which has been a really, really outstanding issue for or factor in the South African economic narrative of the last 20 years, actually.
Very similar in some ways, I suppose, then to Russia's economic prospects under sort of Yeltsin and Putin, with the increase in the oil prices in the 2000s.
Exactly. Look at the I mean, if you look at the charts of the Russian economy in from when Putin took over, yes, he restored confidence among Russians that the country was had strong leadership, but also it was a terrific time for the oil price and gas prices. Yeah,
absolutely. I just want to bring this to an end, Alec. It's been a really interesting talk. I want to reflect on South Africa as a kind of post-colonial country. And I'm interested to see what you think about this. I think that it'll split people, what I'm about to say, but obviously the ANC has been in power since 1994. South Africa is still a country with many economic and cultural and social difficulties, and the ghost of apartheid still casts, it seems, a long shadow over the country. There's little doubt about that, and politicians there still attribute many problems to apartheid. My question to you is, how long do the ANC have to be in power before apartheid is no longer blamed for the issues affecting the country? And just to kind of establish this, I'm prepared to think quite a long time. You know, if all that has happened since 1994 is different people have run the country to before, but the economic disparities that existed under apartheid and grew under the colonial period have just continued anyway. But on the other hand, there has to be accountability for bad government, and clearly Zuma's government was terrible, and it was full of awful moments and awful decisions. And arguably just blaming the issues that South Africa has now on the machinations of the pre-94 era is not going to help South Africa in the long run. This is a controversial question, but what do you think? Where do you stand on this?
We are now coming quite close to 30 years since Nelson Mandela became president. It's a long time. A large number of South Africans have been born in a free South Africa. But that said, the ANC arguably will, as the years pass, more and more fall back on apartheid as an argument to explain what they have, or rather haven't done. So I don't think we're going to hear an end of of blaming apartheid for a long time. And also, I mean, fair enough, the ANC doesn't have a great record in government. I always found that ministers, including many of the good ministers, were broadly better at articulating the problem and coming up with great takes on what needed to be done to education, water, whatever. But they were better at that than delivering. So they don't have a stellar record in government. But equally, they were dealt a pretty tricky hand. How do you transform an economy that has been designed to work really well for about 15% of the population and really shabbily for most of the rest of the population? It's not exactly straightforward, particularly if you're trying to make sure that the 15% of the population that it was designed to work really well for stay, because you need them for their know-how and frankly for their economic resources. Yeah. So I think that apartheid will continue to be blamed, but obviously, well, I say obviously, but I think it will become a weaker argument for the electorate, because the electorate know, they see these councillors, these ANC councillors, they see these ANC MPs. They're no fools. They understand that some of these characters are just whizzing around and are not doing anything. So the ANC is starting to pay an electoral price for this. And you can see bit by bit, you can see their share of the vote coming down. It started at this colossal, late percentage in the late 60s, and it's going down and down, particularly in the big cities. And that's what will be really interesting about the next election in South Africa, seeing how close to the 50% level does it fall.
Alec, that's been great. Thank you very much. Where can people, if people want to sort of, read more about this topic, or if they want to follow your work, where can they go? What can they look out for? I know the answer to this, but perhaps other people don't.
There's so many great books that are written about South Africa. It's one of these stories, narratives that keeps on attracting good non-fiction works. There was a whole run of books that came out around the end of Jacob Zuma's presidency, including one by a veteran investigative journalist, a man called Jacques Pauw, who just wrote about one or two government departments, the inside story about how they were looted. And there are people like Justice Malala and Monli Makanya, who are long-term South African journalists, Peter Bruce, Ferial Haffajee, who are just writing so much good stuff. I think you're rather sweetly referring to a book I wrote a long time ago now, but this was now over a decade ago, after Mandela, and that was a look at the Mbeki years and the rise of Jacob Zuma, but broadly, I suppose, trying to give an outsider's perspective on South Africa's progress, because I spent 5 years there as a reporter from 93 to 98. So I saw the glory years, well, the awful year of the last year of White Rule, when it was just terrible things happening one day after another. And then the magic of 94. And it was a time when giants walked the earth, really. And that was Nelson Mandela and his golden generation of contemporaries. And it was a very, very inspiring time. And sometimes people say to me, "Oh, were you all a bit starry-eyed? And when you failing to highlight the weaknesses of the ANC that have now come into stark relief and so on?" I say, you know what? Maybe that's true, but I don't think it was the wrong thing to do. I think that it was a time of great hope, not just for South Africa, but for the world. And it was fine to present it as a time of hope. There's no point in anticipating problems before they come sometimes. So that was when I was first there, and then I went back to South Africa 10 years later for the last couple of years of Thabo Mbeki's time in office. And so based on those two periods and lots of trips in between, I wrote this book about South Africa. So you can turn to that as well if you want to.
Alec, thank you very much.
Tom, thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.